important issue right now in America than policing. And this panel is going to be addressing the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. We're going to have a number of panelists, and we will introduce them in just a moment. But right now, it is our honor and privilege to have the sponsor or one of the sponsors of the bill in the United States Congress, the Honorable Karen Bass, representative from the 37th Congressional District in California, to talk to us and tell us a little bit about the bill.
Hello. Let me thank the Reverend for such a kind introduction and congratulate you for your leadership over many decades. The National Action Network has made a profound difference in our country, and I know it will continue to until we achieve racial, social, and economic justice. And thank you so much for this panel today on the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. Let me just talk a brief minute about the bill. First of all, the most important part of the bill holds police officers accountable. We watched when Derek Chauvin was murdering George Floyd with his knee on his neck, looking at that camera with his hand in his pocket, acting like he had complete impunity, because up until the passage of this bill, frankly, he does. We need to hold officers accountable. They need to be sued if they hurt us, if they kill us. They need to be prosecuted. The standard to prosecute an officer is so high right now, we have to prove what was in their mind. We need to say that that knee on the neck for 9 minutes, we learned, is reckless, and he should be accountable, and that was murder. There are 18,000 police departments in the United States and no national standards, no accreditation. You have to have accreditation to have your hair cut, but not to be a police officer. And then we need to provide resources to communities so communities can re-envision policing, because we know that over the last few decades we have wiped out, damaged, left our safety net in tatters. And so when things fall through the cracks, we leave it to police officers to pick up the pieces. Police officers shouldn't have to deal with mental health issues. People in a mental health crisis, when family members call the police for help, they shouldn't worry about the police coming in and killing their relative. And so we need to refund our communities. We need to rebuild our safety net. We need to put our resources in health, in social, and in economic programs. And so the bill provides grants to communities to re-envision policing. Now we need to get the bill passed out of the Senate. So I am hoping that the National Action Network, during your conference, will help to mobilize, help to bring out the pressure. The reason we had the bill in Congress last year was because of the hundreds of thousands of people that were out on the street and demanded change. And so I hope that the National Action Network will continue in your tradition to build that movement, to pressure the Senate, to make sure that we get that bill on President Biden's desk ASAP. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your invitation to speak with you today.
All right. Let's give a big hand to the Honorable Karen Bass, representative of the 37th Congressional District in California. So we do have a tremendous panel, brothers and sisters, and you know, there really is no more important issue confronting our nation right now than the issue of policing. And as the Congresswoman just said, there will be a battle to get this act past Congress. And sometimes, and some of you were here for the panel this morning with the mothers of the movement, and one of the things when you think about the mothers of the movement and some of what they said is their endurance. Because when you think about the fight for justice and getting these bills through the Congress, it's not about it happening today or tomorrow. It's not about now. It's about how long can you endure in the fight to make sure these things happen, and that's what we are about, and that's what many of the people you will hear today speak about. It is truly ironic when you think about the Michael Brown situation in Ferguson, Missouri. horrible situation. Everything about that situation said it was willful on the part of the police officer, but he could not get justice, either state or federal. Eric Garner, we watched Eric Garner on tape get strangled to death, but no prosecution on the state level, and on the federal level, there was a fight between the Justice Department in Washington, D.C., and the Eastern District in New York over whether or not they could establish the willfulness for there to be a successful prosecution. And at the end of the day, there was no prosecution in Eric Garner. So that's why we are fighting for this act. The George Floyd Justice in Policing Act is critical to the fight to make a more perfect union with regard to policing in America. We're so pleased today to have on the panel with us Chief Sherilyn C.J. Davis. She's from the Durham Police Department. She's been there for 32 years, dedicated service in law enforcement. She began her career with the Atlanta Police Department, where she learned the essential elements of community engagement and relationship building as a young officer. There she rose through the ranks and eventually became the chief of police for the city of Durham. We welcome her and happy to have her with us this morning. We also want to welcome Jericho Richardson. She's the Senior Vice President for Equitable Justice and Strategic Initiatives for the National Urban League. She leads the organization's advocacy and public education and strategic work on civic engagement, police reform, criminal justice reform, and other justice-related issues. Previously, Ms. Richardson was Deputy Executive Director and Senior Advisor to the Secretary to the Board for the nation's largest independent police oversight agency, the New York City Civilian Complaint Review Board. Let's give Jericho a big welcome. And we also want to welcome, and he is here live and in color, as they say, Dr. Takoi Porter. He is the president of our National Action Network Sacramento chapter, senior pastor of the Genesis Church in Sacramento, and we are pleased and happy to have Dr. Porter with us today. Let's welcome all of them. So we will kick it off. I will start by asking Chief Davis. Chief, please say hello to everybody and just give us some initial thoughts on this very important topic.
Well, good afternoon, Mr. Hardy and distinguished panelists, and definitely to Reverend Sharpton and the Honorable Karen Bass and Nan. Thank you for giving us an opportunity, Noble, for always being a part of these very critical conversations. Today, we all hurt once again. We are all very frustrated and perplexed as we mourn the tragic death of another African-American male, Dante Wright, at the hands of the police. So while Noble has been very, very active and engaged in reform efforts, we all know it's not enough. There's still much work to be done, as it was said earlier by Senator Booker. There's much work to be done, but we just appreciate this opportunity that you all are leading in this dialogue and providing a platform for our voices, the voices of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, to be heard at this very painful but pivotal time in our nation's history. So thank you very much.
All right. Jericho Richardson, a few words to get us going.
Thank you, Mr. Hardy, Reverend Sharpton, and everyone at the National Action Network, as well as the rest of my colleagues on this distinguished panel. I'm Jericho Richardson, Senior Vice President for Equitable Justice at the National Urban League. And it truly is an honor to be having this conversation at this time. because we all know the history of slavery and its roots in this country, whether we're talking about overseers and slave patrols to black codes and Jim Crow. You know, despite integration, despite a lot of the gains that we've seen with more diversity in law enforcement, for us as people of color, and particularly African Americans, policing has just not been synonymous with public safety. And so I'm really glad that we are taking this moment to talk about this really important piece of legislation, because I think it's one of the tools in our toolkit that we need to really improve the quality of life for civilians and for law enforcement alike.
All right, thank you. Dr. Porter,
Dr. Porter,
few words
few
to
words
get us
to
going
get
on
us
this
going on
topic.
this topic.
Yeah, well, good afternoon, and to you all and to those back on the West Coast, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here in New York and with my National Action Network family to discuss this very important and relevant issue of the day. We're seeing news come out all the time in regards to bad policing and police misconduct, and so we definitely need to make sure that we get something passed federally so that we can stop burying our babies, right, and mourning and protesting and get something good happen for our communities. What happens good for our community will benefit all communities, and so I'm glad to be here and to be along with these esteemed panelists. Thank you.
All right. Jericho, let me start with you, and could you outline for us why civil rights organizations like National Action Network and the Urban League support this legislation?
Well, it's for many of the reasons that Representative Bass laid out. We really need a comprehensive approach that tackles accountability, that ends racial profiling, that makes lynching a federal crime, that really gives our communities the opportunity to empower themselves and really redefine what public safety means. And then if we're talking about saving lives, all we have to do is look at George Floyd and Eric Garner and Breonna Taylor, and we really need to fundamentally ban chokeholds and no-knock warrants, because it's killing our community. And I think one of the other things that it's really underscores why we need the comprehensive approach, because right now we don't see equity in the way justice is meted out. If we take a look at the recent reports about the officer involved in the Jacob Blake case and the Jacob Blake incident, he's now back on the job. But if we look back 15 years to the officer in Buffalo, an African-American officer, an African-American woman officer at that, who stepped in, was an upstander, and actually stopped her colleague from putting a chokehold on a civilian, she was fired for that. So what we're really looking for is we're looking for equity and national standards. And I think without them, we can never say that in America, I think we should just stop using the term justice system. We should say legal system, because until we move more comprehensive reform forward, it's still unjust.
That's so true. Chief Davis, you're the past president and now the chief of police in Durham, North Carolina. In May of 2020, Noble put out a statement regarding the murder of George Floyd. It encouraged law enforcement agencies to adopt effective policing policies and training to build community trust. Can you outline those points that Noble made?
So, yes, I can. Thank you again. So in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, Noble quickly began drafting what we believed to be critical police reform recommendations to Congress to consider. We started with 4 major recommendations. But after years of working in this space and understanding the many obstacles that block police reform, to include the systematic, I will say, dismissal of President Obama's 21st Century Policing Task Force recommendations, we knew that critical and impactful change could only be realized through the legislative process. So last year, during my testimony before the U.S. Senate Committee on the Judiciary, we called for national standards. And Representative Bass, the Honorable Representative Bass, mentioned, we call for national standards, which means that police agencies must adopt policies supported by best practices, national best practices. That effectively puts an end to the buffet or smorgasbord type picking and choosing what policies and practices an agency implements. So we believe that every agency should be held to a standard that effectuates real change in key areas. The banning of chokeholds, prohibiting no-knock warrants, you've heard that, especially on drug offenses, limit qualified immunity, mandate officers to adhere to de-escalation training and those policies, duty to intervene. Duty to intervene was so critical in the George Floyd situation. If the officers were mandated to step in and do something instead of standing around, we would have had a different end. And also to invest in social services and programs that prevent crime and address social injustices. So whether it's diversifying departments, fighting for legislative reform, or implementing community programs, Noble, we're committed to doing the work, to building community trust and leading the change that our nation so desperately needs right now.
All right. Sister Richardson, I'm going to come back to you very quickly. How will the legislation empower our communities to reimagine public safety in an equitable and just way?
Okay. Well, empowering our communities really involves recognizing their values and putting the people who are right now closest to the problem, putting them in power because they're also closest to the solution. It will provide grants for communities. It will create task force and commissions, and it will just really help communities as a whole reimagine and develop concrete, just, and equitable public safety approaches. And so I think we need to give them this power. We need to be able to have them direct where resources go for mental health or guidance counselors in schools, substance abuse programs, a whole host of issues that really need our attention. And we really need to move in a way where we have a unified vision of moving forward because it needs to be a system that really is empowered but is centered on truth.
All right. Dr. Porter, National Action Network over the last 30 years has tirelessly worked on reforming practices of policing. What are some of the critical reform components of policing in this bill?
Well, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act addresses three key areas of reform in which our esteemed panelists have already talked about, but transparency being one, training, and then accountability. We've talked about the banning the use of chokeholds, and more specifically carotid holds, which are very deadly in itself, but as we've seen with George Floyd, can cause death in itself. And so there's that, then there's the banning the use of no-knock warrants, which we all know what happened in the case of Breonna Taylor, and we know that case, but what about the cases that we don't know that this occurred to? So we're banning the use of no-knock warrants, requiring officers to intervene to prevent abuse. It was just stated upon by the chief, requiring national standards for police departments and officers as well, creating that standard across the board nationally so that it's not just a pick and choose option of how you want to police in a certain state, city, neighborhood. Also, another key component of this bill is restricting police access to weaponry designed specifically for military. I think this is very important because police should not turn our communities into battlefields. Police forces should not act like an occupying force. And we know this to be true, especially in underserved communities, in our brown and black communities. You know, they come in with the tanks and the big guns and all that, just for us, and whom they've sworn to protect and serve. And then there's another key component here that we don't want to overlook, which is changing the use of force standard through the Peace Act. And in California, we're part of the AB 392, which we've named the Stephon Clark Law. And the Peace Act is very similar to what we passed in California, which says that whether it's going to evaluate use of force from whether the force was reasonable to whether it was necessary. So it changes it from reasonable to necessary. Necessary means that another reasonable federal law enforcement officer will objectively conclude under the totality of the circumstances that there was no reasonable alternative to the use of force. What this does is establishes a de-escalation tactic and technique. And again, we're happy to say that California led off in that measure where we changed that necessary, we included necessary into that context in the Stephon Clark Law.
All right. Chief Davis, I'm going to come back to you, and I'm going to give you a two-part question. One is, why is it so difficult on the state level to get the kind of enforcement and prosecution of police officers when they do wrong, and which is one of the underlying reasons why so much effort is now going into, as has been historically the case, when you're battling states' rights, to try to get people simply to act right. Why do you think that's so difficult on the local and state level?
Well, I think history sort of speaks to that much of the practices and protocols are so steeped in history and even in support of law enforcement, traditional law enforcement for years. Many states continue to support outdated practices that do not support the rights of individuals and citizens. And certain protections have been on the books for many, many years, and that environment and that climate still exists, and it's very hard to penetrate. It was mentioned earlier about 18,000 law enforcement agencies, but those 18,000 law enforcement agencies are led by individuals that are supported by elected officials, and sometimes it's very, very hard to move that needle at the state level.
And with regard to that then, in terms of the work that you're doing with Noble, how does your organization lead the reform work from the law enforcement perspective to impact the change that we are all seeking?
So since 1976, Noble has really served, even though we are small in number compared to the 18,000, but since 1976, and you think about that era, we've served as a conscience of law enforcement by being committed to justice by action, not just talking about what needs to be done, but trying to effectuate laws to create meaningful change. But as members of minority populations, we feel uniquely positioned to lead in these conversations because the parallel that exists between our history and our profession, there is something to be said about that. When I get up in the morning, I don't wake up with my uniform on. I wake up as an African-American female that's very much in touch with my community, the injustices of the past. And Noble feels that we are in a position where we should push for change. We represent 3,000 members internationally. We are primarily all Black chief executives of law enforcement agencies in the feds, in the state, and in local municipalities, and also law enforcement administrators and criminal justice practitioners. So Noble's put out a couple of publications that we believe are sort of roadmaps. One is under our current president, Linda Williams, is entitled Reimagining Public Safety. It was a task force that was put together, and they published in the last few months a roadmap for communities and their law enforcement agencies to reimagine public safety and make strategic funding decisions. And then another one that I helped sponsor was in partnership with John Jay College. And this was a document about the future of public safety as well, what direction we should go. So even though there are 18,000 law enforcement agencies throughout the nation, Noble has taken some very bold steps to engage leaders outside of our membership. We're trying to touch the leadership in other agencies that don't look like us, because I can control what happens in the city of Durham, but I can't control or influence what happens in small town USA. And, you know, I spoke about the 21st century policing principles, which are based on a foundation of constitutional policing, legitimacy, and procedural justice. These concepts, which promote sweeping changes, are clearly outlined in the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. So I believe that we must continue to support legislation like the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act and other legislative proposals that ultimately ensure safe and livable communities for people of color.
Yeah, and you know, when you think about constitutional policing, you have to always ask yourself, what is so difficult about that for law enforcement in particular to get with and follow? It really shouldn't be as hard as it has been historically, but the fight continues, and certainly Noble is leading on that issue. Qualified immunity, Sister Richardson, is a court-created restriction, if you will. It was created by the courts. Some say it truly does insulate law enforcement officers who may, in many cases, knowingly violate a constitutional right of a person that they're dealing with. But if it was not technically a known right, they can get a qualified immunity with regard to having to, at least in the civil context, be responsible for that conduct. Why is this, in terms of the bill that is now before the Congress in terms of qualified immunity? Certainly National Action Network and the Urban League are organizations that truly support and have fought for and are trying to end qualified immunity. But can you speak to why the legislation is a step in the right direction with engaging on this issue of qualified immunity?
Well, the legislation is definitely a step in the right direction because the one thing that we see over and over again when we talk about the events of 2021 or 2020 or even the years leading up to it was the public's mistrust in the system for the fact that there's a lack of accountability. And while we are looking for more accountability from the courts on the criminal side, the civil component is something that is just as important. You laid out qualified immunity. I think one of the things that we've seen over the years is it acts like absolute immunity. And really ending that is critically important to restore public trust. But it's also important for police officers, for them to understand that there are consequences and repercussions to their actions. Right now, we have civilians in these settlement agreements. Essentially, the public is paying the price for these settlements. And so we really need to have members of law enforcement abide by their oath, really live up to the duty that has been given them. And we need to stop shielding those who are committing misconduct. You know, you should not be shielded for engaging in activity like that, because it's killing folks, it's harming us, it's harming the community. And we're the ones that are really paying the price for that. So there really needs to be some more individual responsibility. And I think the power of the purse and really forcing folks to have to be financially held responsible for their actions is an extremely important step.
All right, thank you. Dr. Porter, as the nation watches the George Floyd, well, I should say the Derek Chauvin trial for the killing of George Floyd, many are filled with dread as we await as we approach the moment when we may see the jury get this case, and of course the jury will have to make a decision and try to reach a verdict. The purpose of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is to make it easier to hold officers accountable for their actions. Hypothetically, had the bill been signed into law before last summer, can you talk about how the components of the bill would impact the trial we have been watching?
Yeah, well, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act changes the standard for prosecuting and convicting officers that unlawfully kill or brutalize people. So current law requires evidence that an officer meant to kill someone or violate their civil right. Thus, we have to try to build up the case of them meaning to do something, meaning to kill someone or for their misconduct. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act calls for prosecution when an officer is reckless and kills someone or violates their civil right. What does this mean? This tells us that whether Derek Chauvin meant to kill George Floyd shouldn't matter. What matters is that George Floyd is dead at the hands of an officer sworn to serve and protect and enforce the law, and those responsible must be held accountable. Also, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act bans chokeholds. We've said this countless of times. So the move that Derek Chauvin used to kill George Floyd will be illegal. That means that George Floyd could be alive today if that was once this bill was enacted. It was enacted before George Floyd tragedy happened. He could be alive today, and we would not even know the name of George Floyd. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act will make it so that Derek Chauvin was facing a federal felony for using a chokehold to kill George Floyd. There's some other things that we have to look at. We've heard about the report to intervene in abuse. The officers standing by watching Derek Chauvin kill George Floyd are also responsible for his death. They are complicit in his death and should be held accountable. And the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act requires training for federal officers on their duty to intervene when they see another officer using excessive force and incentivizes states to do the same. Had the bill been law, all of the officers would have been trained on their duty to intervene, as we have stated before, when Chauvin clearly used excessive force by kneeling on George Floyd's neck for what we now know was over 9 minutes, and they will be penalized for their inaction. Also, I think the other thing that we can look at is that the act makes it so that the public is informed, and this is key, about officers being corrupt, dangerous, and abusive. So there's a transparency there. Since joining the Minnesota Police Department in 2001, Derek Chauvin had at least 17 complaints filed against him. In 2017, Officer Tao was sued for excessive use of force against a man and a woman who was 8 months pregnant, according to the complaint. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act sets up a national database of abusive, racist, violent, and/or corrupt officers so communities can see who they are and prevent them from being hired as officers anywhere else after they are fired. Both of these officers would have been included in the national registry established by the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act.
Right, and this is a fight that, as we said at the top, is not something that's going to happen overnight. We have to be diligent in doing this. There are bills in front of the Congress right now, and so we have to be out on those front lines trying to get those bills through the Congress, because at the end of the day, and as the chief alluded to, policing should be constitutional, should be fair and impartial, and should certainly not be based on race. And so with that said, I want to give our panelists a moment to close us out. We thank you for being with us. Of course, you know, once you get going, the time just kind of shoots by so quick. So I want to give our panelists an opportunity to close us out. And let me just start with you, Chief Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Hardy, again, and thank you to my distinguished panelists. I really appreciate the opportunity. But, you know, the continual cycle of the shocking incidents between police and citizens, it just begs the question of how do we keep ending up here? How is it that we have not moved the needle far enough that these egregious incidents continue to play out over and over again? So I can say that Noble will continue to work towards the day when police executives and civic leadership can stop having to explain away the failures of our profession. I believe that the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, it is the perfect start as a national mandate for law enforcement agencies around this country. So again, thank you for allowing us to have an opportunity to have voice on this platform.
All right, Sister Richardson.
Well, thank you all for having me. And I agree with Chief Davis that the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act really lays the groundwork for meaningful reforms. But I want to just reiterate to our community and to all those watching that it is the floor, and there is still work that needs to be done. And we need to be engaged both on the state and local level to push forward reforms. And just one quick call to action, because as we think about Dr. King and the fierce urgency of now, we see everything that's happening around us. We have to act. So the National Action Network, the National Urban League, the NAACP, the Legal Defense Fund, and many others really have been banding together around a campaign to ensure that this George Floyd Justice and Policing Act passes in its original form. So please reach out to your senators and encourage them to keep these meaningful reforms. Don't weaken this bill. And you can do that by texting Justice Now to 52886. Again, that's Justice Now to 52886. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, and Dr. Porter.
Yes. Well, I just want to say I'm glad to be a part of this organization, the National Action Network, under the leadership of Reverend Al Sharpton, to fight for change in such a bold manner. You know, for far too long, our nation has met the cycle of police brutality and racism with tinkering at the edges instead of real change. And to be clear, we cannot and will not accept an incremental approach to justice, nor go through this cycle over and over again. Just this past week, we have seen tragedy happen again in Minnesota with the murder of 20-year-old Dante Wright by Brooklyn Center police officer Kim Potter, an experienced, quote-unquote experienced officer who couldn't tell the difference between a taser and a gun. Enough is enough. And we are sick and tired of burying our young, protesting in the streets, marching, just to get fair policing in our communities. We have to transform the culture of policing to help save lives. And now is the time to take this meaningful step to reimagine what kind of America we want to build, an America where all people can live safely and freely. Thus, we must urge members of the Senate to support the passage of the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, to take it up and work to strengthen it.
I Can't Breathe should be remembered as the clarion call that caused this nation to rise up, speak truth to power, and bring about the change we deserve. Let's thank Chief Justice. Let's thank Jericho Richardson. Let's thank Dr. Porter. Let's thank the Honorable Congresswoman Karen Bass, and of course, Benjamin Crump, who I stood in for because they have just indicted the police officer in Minneapolis or in Brooklyn Center that killed the young men this week. And we will continue. Thank all of you that are with us. God bless you.
Thank you.
I'm good? All right.
March was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The pursuit of civil rights and economic opportunity were deeply intertwined, and it was clear the country was failing on both counts. In fact, if you looked at the economic data from the year before the march, 1962, the average black family possessed roughly 15% of the wealth of the average white family. That's more than a 6-to-1 difference, and it's stark. But perhaps it isn't surprising. Jim Crow laws were still in effect in many places. What is surprising, though, is that it's now more than half a century later, and that 6-to-1 number has barely budged. Today, African Americans remain unemployed at roughly twice the rate of white Americans. And that number hasn't changed much in 50 years either. It's as close to a constant as you come in economic data. Indeed, if you somehow transported my college economics professor to 2021 and you only showed them the employment and the wealth numbers, they would have a hard time guessing that the country had passed the Civil Rights Act, or that we had elected our first black president, or our first black vice president. Instead, they might actually notice signs that the country had headed in the opposite direction, especially after 2008. During the last recession, the highest white unemployment ever reached was 9.2%. But black unemployment was trapped above 10% for 5 years. It reached 17%, and it hit its peak earlier and recovered slower than unemployment for almost any other group. That is what economic crises do. They hit people of color harder and longer. They push our country towards more inequality. This past year, we saw it happen again. During the early days of the pandemic, African Americans were the first to lose their small businesses and their jobs. And as the economy opens back up, early data suggests that black workers will be the last to be rehired. Will this pandemic be yet another generational setback for people of color? When I took office, I really worried that would be the case. We know that when the foundations of someone's life collapse, when they lose a small business or the roof over their head or the ability to eat dinner every night, it can weigh them down permanently. Their ability to earn is forever lowered. It's a phenomenon called economic scarring. I worried this would happen on a mass scale, especially in communities of color. But I do not think it will anymore. Last month, President Biden signed the American Rescue Plan, and I'm confident it provides enough relief for people to make it to the other side of this pandemic. In the end, it may still be true that the pandemic economy hit people of color harder, but I think the effects will be far milder than they would have been without the plan. But let me also say this. I know that's not enough. It's not sufficient that we just avoid an historic setback for Black Americans. On the other side of this crisis, we have to do more to unwind this sad, long history. The fact that for 50 years, the economy has not worked well for communities of color, that we haven't yet lived up to Dr. King's vision. This is a profound economic and moral challenge. It's one I've cared about since I was in college, majoring in economics. and it's one I still care about now that I'm Treasury Secretary of the United States. For as long as I'm in this office, I want to work to make sure this economy works for everybody. I know we won't complete the job in my tenure, but my goal is that years from now, people see a difference. I do not know if any of you have children entering college or if they're studying economics, but my sincere hope is that by the time they are my age, and in fact well before that, they'll be able to look back at the economic data and see clear evidence that this country has made significant progress, and that progress started now. Thank you so much.